Mr. Whitmore, should I be wondering why I'm here?
Look on that table. Ah, it's for you.
It's from my grandfather.
He brought that package to me years ago. He said if anything would have happened to him, I should give it to you when you were ready. Whatever that means.
It can't be. It's the Shepherd's Journal. Mr. Whitmore, this journal is the key to finding the lost continent of Atlantis.
Atlantis! Wasn't born yesterday, son.
No. Look at this. Coordinates, clues. It's all right here.
Yeah, it looks like gibberish to me.
That's because it's been written in a dialect that no longer exists.
Oh, it's useless.
No, just difficult. I spent my whole life studying dead languages. It's not gibberish to me.
Ah, it's probably a fake.
Mr. Whitmore, my grandfather would have known if this were a fake. I would know. I will stake everything I own, everything that I believe in, that this is the genuine Shepherd's Journal.
All right. So what do you want to do with it?
Well, I'll get funding. I mean, the museum.
They'll never believe you.
I'll show them. I will make them believe.
Like you did today.
Yes. Well, how did you forget about them? Okay, never mind. I will find Atlantis on my own. I mean, if I have to rent a rowboat.
In a world overflowing with movies, we need a hero. Someone to separate the bad from the good.
Sounds like a job. Verbal dioramas. Watches all the movies from comedy to drama. From the top roll sound. And don't forget the action. She'll watch until the end and then she'll give you her reaction. Movies you know, movies you don't. Prequels, sequels, remakes, and trivia and outtakes. Movies you know. You don't. Interesting stories, all the categories.
Hi everyone, I'm Emma. Welcome to Verbal Diorama episode 289, Atlantis, the Lost Empire. This is the podcast that's all about the history and legacy of movies you know, and movies you don't, that knows the difference between the ciphers for R and C. As always, a huge welcome to Verbal Diorama, whether you're a brand new listener, whether you're a regular returning listener, welcome back if you are. Thank you for being here. Thank you for choosing to listen to this podcast. I am, as always, so happy to have you here for the history and legacy of Atlantis, the Lost Empire. And this is the final episode of animation season. It's also the final episode of the 3-episode birthday extravaganza for Verbal Diorama, because Verbal Diorama is now 6 years old. This podcast started in February 2019. Every year I do animation season, and every year for the anniversary of this podcast, I get to talk about animated movies. And this time around, I wanted to look at Disney, undoubtedly the biggest animation studio in the world. And I wanted to look at the Renaissance era, but specifically pre-Renaissance, the actual Renaissance, and post-Renaissance. And Atlantis falls very much into that post-Renaissance era. As I mentioned, this is animation season 2025. This is the final episode of animation season 2025. It wasn't going to be the final episode. However, I have ever so slightly overdone it, and I have actually ran out of time to do another episode. But I'm going to try and plan the episode in a few months' time. So don't worry, there will be another animated movie coming on Verbal Diorama very soon, and it is an absolutely outstanding movie as well. I just couldn't quite fit it in. Because as it turns out, having a podcast and trying to do 3 episodes to be released in a 1-week period when you don't take any time off work to do them, it's really hard. So yeah, I've had to, unfortunately, finish animation season a little bit earlier, but hopefully finishing it in style. This is the 5th annual animation season, and it's just a huge celebration of everything to do with animation from all the animation studios that you know and the ones that you don't as well. Animation, it's not just for children. I think this movie proves that. Animation is not a genre. Animation is just an incredible art form. And animation season is here to highlight those incredible animated films that you may have discounted for whatever reason, but you really shouldn't be discounting movies just because they're animated. As I mentioned, this podcast is now 6 years old, and just a huge thank you to everyone who has supported this podcast over the last 6 years, who has supported me doing this podcast over the last 6 years. This podcast is genuinely one of the biggest joys of my life, and being able to go on this podcast, to produce this podcast, to research stuff for this podcast genuinely brings me so much joy. And considering I've been doing it for 6 years, you'd think I'd be pretty tired of it by now, but I'm actually not. I genuinely love everything that I do for this podcast. And I am so grateful for you listening to this podcast, even if this is your first episode. Hopefully you'll want to listen to some others. But from the bottom of my heart, thank you for supporting me, for supporting this podcast for the last 6 years. And hopefully for another 6 years, I'll still be here and I'll still be talking about the histories and legacies of the movies that are just miracles and fascinating and wonderful. And Atlantis, the Lost Empire ticks all of those boxes for me. The Disney Renaissance officially ended in 1999 with Tarzan. Fantasia 2000, Dinosaur, and The Emperor's New Groove followed. I'm especially fond of The Emperor's New Groove. I've done an episode on that. It's episode 190. That is also a fascinating story. But the start of the new millennium was a transitional time for Disney, an attempt to do something different, to broaden its horizons, and to do a movie on one of the most famous lost civilizations of all time. From last episode's myth of Hercules, now to the myth of Atlantis. Or is it a myth? Here's the trailer for Atlantis, the Lost Empire.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Now, we've all heard of the legend of Atlantis. Pure fantasy. Well, that is where you'd be wrong.
That young Thatch gets crazier every year.
I can prove Atlantis exists. I'm sure of it this time.
Milo James Thatch. I'm acting on behalf of my employer, who has a most intriguing proposition for you.
It's the Shepherd's Journal. This journal is the key to finding the lost continent of Atlantis.
They'll never believe you.
I will find Atlantis on my own. I mean, if I have to rent a rowboat.
This is exactly what I wanted to hear. But forget the rowboat, son. We'll travel in style.
You're gonna need a crew.
Yes, Mr. Thatch.
Well, you'll need engineers and geologists.
Got 'em all. The best of the best. Gaetan Moliere, geology and excavation. Audrey Ramirez, don't let her age fool you.
Name Sweet, Joshua Sweet, medical officer.
Vincenzo Santorini, demolitions.
Hey, look, I made a bridge.
Lieutenant, take her down.
Diving officer, submerge the ship.
Looks like all our chances for survival rest with you, Mr. Thatch. You and that little book.
Soleshma tonot Milo Thatch ton.
In 1914, young linguist orphan Milo Thatch, grandson of Thaddeus Thatch, buries himself in books trying to unlock the secret to the destruction of Atlantis. Although his theories are ridiculed by his colleagues, he's persistent in his dreams of one day discovering the Lost Isle. His dreams are realised when he's given a spot in an expedition, financed by a friend of his grandfather, to go in search of Atlantis following Milo's guide, The Shepherd's Journal. The intrepid crew find Atlantis and a whole indigenous population who live by powerful crystal energy. but some members of the crew want to steal the powerful crystal energy for themselves. Let's run through the cast of this movie. We have Michael J. Fox as Milo Thatch, James Garner as Commander Rourke, Cree Summer as Kida, Don Novello as Vinny, Phil Morris as Sweet, Claudia Christian as Helga, Jacqueline Obradors as Audrey, Florence Stanley as Packard, John Mahoney as Preston B. Whitmore, Jim Varney as Cookie, Corey Burton as Mole, and Leonard Nimoy as Kashakim, the King of Atlantis. Atlantis the Lost Empire has a screenplay by Tab Murphy, a story by Kirk Wise, Gary Trousdale, Joss Whedon, Bruce Zabel, Jackie Zabel, and Tab Murphy, and was directed by Gary Trousdale and Kirk Wise. If Atlantis really existed, no one wrote about it until Plato, who did so 9,000 years after its destruction, which does beg the question of why no one else wrote about Atlantis. Plato's Atlantis myth appears in two of his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, written around 360 BC. According to Plato, Atlantis was a powerful island civilization beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the modern Strait of Gibraltar, originally created by Poseidon, who fell in love with a mortal woman named Cleito. Atlantis was rich in natural resources, including a precious metal called orichalcum. It was highly advanced and protected by massive walls plated with bronze, tin, and orichalcum. The Atlantean Empire attempted to conquer Europe and Asia. Athens then led the resistance against Atlantis and succeeded in defeating them. Shortly afterward, a natural disaster struck Atlantis with floods and earthquakes, and the island sank into the sea in a single day and night. Atlantis the Lost Empire draws from Plato's original Atlantis myth, as well as classic adventure stories like Jules Verne's Journey to the Centre of the Earth from 1864 and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea from 1870, as well as Victorian-era adventure fiction and steampunk, various New Age interpretations of Atlantis, and elements from Edgar Cayce's readings about Atlantis. I'm going to come back to Edgar Cayce in a little bit. The creation of Atlantis the Lost Empire first started over a lunch in 1996, with Don Hahn, Gary Trousdale, Kirk Wise, and Tab Murphy having recently completed The Hunchback of Notre Dame and wanting to do something new with the Hunchback of crew. The idea was to draw inspiration from Jules Verne's Journey to the Centre of the Earth and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, set around the legendary city of Atlantis, having a movie set within an Adventureland setting rather than a Fantasyland setting, with Adventureland and Fantasyland both being Disney theme park areas. The team were keen to produce an action-heavy animated film set in the mythological lost city of Atlantis, which Verne's work had briefly touched upon. Trousdale soon approached Disney chairman and CEO Michael Eisner with the pitch for Atlantis the Lost Empire. Eisner was a big supporter of Wise and Trousdale. They directed Beauty and the Beast. And at the time, Eisner was feuding with Roy E. Disney, Walt's nephew, and a powerful member of the board for control of the company. Executive Peter Schneider, the president of Walt Disney Feature Animation, and Thomas Schumacher, Disney Studios president, were focusing more of their attention on Disney Theatrical, the stage play and musicals divisions, basically the Broadway versions. Because of all of these factors, Atlantis didn't just get an immediate green light, but senior management trusted Trousdale and Wise to do what they needed to do. Eisner was distracted, and this would lead to very little executive meddling. Trousdale and Wise were in agreement that the film they were making would not be musical. Eisner just happened to be the executive at Paramount, who'd given the green light to a little movie called Raiders of the Lost Ark, and he wanted a similar action-adventure vibe for Atlantis the Lost Empire. Famously, the production crew wore t-shirts to work that read, "Atlantis, fewer songs, more explosions." Trousdale and Wise disliked that the city of Atlantis was often portrayed as just a mess of collapsed columns underwater, so they extensively investigated the legend of Atlantis from various sources in order to create a movie that thoroughly examined the civilization. Trousdale and Wise chose to portray the city as a magnificent futuristic metropolis with cutting-edge technology driven by the heart of Atlantis, a powerful crystal that also served as the city's protector. This was partially inspired by the writings of late 19th century clairvoyant Edgar Cayce, with the magical crystal also giving the city's residents longevity and healing abilities. Cayce was a self-proclaimed psychic who gave numerous readings about Atlantis while in trance states. He described Atlanteans using powerful crystals for energy and technology, as well as having healing and life-extending properties. He spoke of Atlantis having advanced technology beyond what existed in his time. The film depicts Atlantis as having highly advanced technology, including flying vehicles and energy-based weapons, powered by the crystal energy. Cayce also described Atlantis being destroyed due to the misuse of its crystal technology. The film's backstory involves Atlantis being submerged due to a catastrophic event related to crystal power. You'll notice I mentioned the name Joss Whedon when I was mentioning the story credits, and Joss Whedon is credited for the story, but his involvement was actually non-existent. He had been briefly involved with a Marco Polo musical when he worked at Disney Animation, and elements of his work included references to Atlantis. The final film contains none of Whedon's work, but he received a credit anyway, mostly due to the advice of Disney's legal team. Tab Murphy wrote the screenplay set in 1914, which focused on Milo Thatch, a young, ambitious linguist and cartographer at the Smithsonian Institute who thinks he's discovered the way to Atlantis. Milo teams up with an eccentric millionaire and friend of his late grandfather, who offers to finance the mission and send a team of experts to help Milo in his ambitious quest after the museum's board rejects his proposed mission. Trousdale and Wise insisted on developing a whole spoken and written language for the Atlanteans in an effort to accurately portray Atlantis as its own distinct civilization. They hired Mark Okrand, an American linguist who created the Klingon language for the Star Trek TV series and its follow-up movies. For the Atlantean language, Okrand used an Indo-European word stock with a unique grammatical framework. In order to generate words that sounded completely different from any language that was known to exist, Okrand spent months developing the spoken language. Coincidentally, Leonard Nimoy also stars in this movie, and obviously he's most famous for playing Spock in Star Trek. John Emerson created the written Atlantean language by drawing hundreds of random drawings of individual letters, from which the filmmakers selected the ones that best reflected their own concept for the language. In order to illustrate the Atlanteans' intimate ties to the land and ocean, the finished patterns typically included swirling lines and dots. All of the text was boustrophedon, meaning the first line should be read from left to right, the second from right to left, and so on. The purpose of this continuous zigzag design was to mimic the natural flow of water. And of course, a major plot point in the movie is that the Atlanteans have forgotten to read their own language, and the only person who can is Milo Thatch. The filmmakers wanted Atlantis the Lost Empire to have a distinct look and feel from what came before it. The primary source of inspiration for Wise and Trousdale was the comic book artwork of Hellboy creator Mike Mignola. They were inspired by the Hercules team's experience working with renowned illustrator Gerald Scarfe, and then hired Mignola to contribute character designs, work on design features like the Atlantean temples, and work on story ideas, including the creation of steampunk elements and mechanical flying fish machines for the film's conclusion. Every visual element of the final film reflected Mignola's unique style, with sharp angular edges and deep lines, which mirrored the artwork of comic books. To further differentiate the movie from anything that had come before it, they had the idea to film in CinemaScope 70mm widescreen format. Executives were initially concerned about the required paper size because the format increased the cost of notable Disney flops, Sleeping Beauty and The Black Cauldron. To view in a test sequence in the 70mm format, Eisner approved the change in production method. From here, Trousdale and Wise were inspired by filmmakers who had used the format in the past, particularly Steven Spielberg, David Lean and Akira Kurosawa, with Spielberg's Raiders of the Lost Ark consistently used as a reference point for the production team. The animators who worked on Sleeping Beauty were sketching on bedsheet-sized paper, and there were discussions about relocating the whole Atlantis crew to a new facility with dedicated, larger workstations. However, this would have cost a fortune, so a compromise was made. The figures and backgrounds would be smaller, and it would therefore fit on a normal sized piece of paper, which was effective because of how stylized it all was. Everything about Atlantis the Lost Empire, though, was huge in style and scope. The first 2 acts were storyboarded and ran over 2 hours. A number of characters were removed from the script, including a phony mystic that joins them on the journey, Mr. Whitmore's nephew, and Milo's pet rat Plato. There goes the cute animal sidekick. A number of action sequences and monster attacks were dramatically pared down, with the journey to Atlantis becoming shorter and less eventful, and the parts in Atlantis receiving more focus. But with this removal of huge chunks of the movie came a reduction in budget, which led to tough choices on what to focus their attention on and what to skimp on. A lavish original prologue featuring a group of Vikings using the same ancient manuscript to find Atlantis cost $5 million to produce. It was fully animated and colour-timed, but late in the production they realised it wasn't working. That prologue was also scrapped and changed up for the destruction of Atlantis to show why it's now below the water and to introduce Kida. Artistic supervisor for story John Sanford pitched the new idea to Don Hahn, and Wise and Trousdale agreed the new idea was better. It was storyboarded overnight and pitched to Disney executives the next day. But this was still a Disney movie, and as the production scaled back, so did some of the edge in the original screenplay. There's still a character smoking, but this was before Disney removed smoking from all productions. But characters still brandish guns, and there are still gunfights. Then, during production, Columbine happened. At the time, it was the second most fatal school shooting in American history. It's now the 6th. After this, questions were asked on depiction of guns or gunplay in films and TV shows. Episodes of TV shows containing guns in schools were postponed, such as an episode of Buffy called Earshot, and Disney decided to also scale the guns back in Atlantis in response to the massacre. When it came to casting, Michael J. Fox had the choice to star in Atlantis or Titan AE. Titan AE being the very first episode of this podcast, of course. So Fox gave the choice to his young son, who chose Atlantis. Cree Summer, a prolific voice actor at the time, was cast as Kida. Her personality and demeanour were also written into how Kida reacts to Milo. And is Kida actually the first Black Disney princess? The fans certainly think so. The rest of the cast is as racially diverse as the crew of the Ulysses, which is actually refreshing to see in an early 2000s Disney movie. It feels like some actual thought has not only been put into the diversity of the crew on screen, but also ensuring that those different racial backgrounds are represented off screen too. Jim Varney, who voiced Cookie, died of lung cancer in February 2000, and so never saw the finished film. Supplementary dialogue for Cookie was recorded by Stephen Barr. Atlantis the Lost Empire utilised more than 350 animators, artists and technicians at its peak. In order to maintain consistency in the look, the film used the services of Walt Disney Feature Animation in Burbank, California, Disney Feature Animation Florida, and Disney Animation France. Designs were either faxed, couriered, or shared digitally between the 3 studios. The movie would eventually feature over 360 digital effects shots, which took more than 3 years to create and featured more computer-generated imagery than any other Disney animated feature film to date. Computer software was used to smoothly integrate 3D created objects and artwork with the 2D animation, especially in scenes involving the Ulysses submarine. The directors also made use of a revolutionary virtual camera, which made it possible for the camera to move fluidly through a digital wireframe set, while post-production added details and background. Only 2 sequences in Atlantis the Lost Empire have no 3D elements. In one sequence, Milo, who is obviously a hand-drawn character, is chased through lava tubes that lead to Atlantis. Background painters used deep canvas software to paint the tubes. However, the lava following Milo through the tubes was drawn by hand in the effects department. One of the most complex effects created digitally was the crystal, the power source for Atlantis, which looks like a tube of light surrounded by rotating stone shields. There were 3 levels of different colour membranes emitting a 3-dimensional kind of light. Animating these crystals traditionally would have been impossible to do. The Leviathan had 100 moving parts, and animating it used traditional techniques adapted for digital 3D creation. The backgrounds for these shots were painted digitally. The Leviathan creature, the main submarine, and the mini-subs are all 3D models. The 3D team rendered tens of thousands of layers to create individual pieces of art for the lines, tone, and paint. The film's final shot, a pull-out shot reminiscent of the closing shot in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which the animators initially felt was too straightforward and wanted to elaborate on, begins with a close-up of Milo and Kida drawn on a 40.5 centimetre piece of paper. It then pulls out to reveal Atlantis in all its splendour, and this is drawn on a massive 45,720 centimetre piece of paper. It's often cited as the most difficult shot in Disney's history. At the same time, Aladdin and Hercules directors Ron Clements and John Musker were finally getting to work on their passion project Treasure Planet, which was due out the following year after Atlantis: The Lost Empire. Treasure Planet and Atlantis share similar aesthetics, a mix of hand-drawn animation and cutting-edge CG animation, as well as a steampunk style. It was another new avenue for Disney animation, and everyone was waiting with bated breath to see how Atlantis: The Lost Empire would be received. Speaking of new avenues, or at least the opposite of new avenues, because this is nothing new, it's time for the obligatory Keanu reference of this episode. And this is a part of the podcast where I try and link every movie that I feature with Keanu Reeves for no reason other than he is the best of men. And originally I thought there was no way I would be able to link Keanu Reeves to Atlantis: The Lost Empire, until I Googled Keanu Atlantis, thinking something's gotta be there. And it was literally straight away that Keanu Reeves is associated with the character B from the comic book Berserker. And the character B is an immortal warrior who protects Atlantis. Theoretically, the same version of Atlantis that Milo and the team visit in this movie. So that is the easiest and best and most brilliant way that I can link Keanu Reeves to Atlantis: The Lost Empire. So while Kirk Wise and Gary Trousdale agreed that Atlantis: The Lost Empire would not be a musical, the studio's marketing department insisted that at least one song be featured during the film's end credits, and this was mostly to adhere to tradition. They enlisted Oscar-nominated songwriter Diane Warren to write a track entitled Where the Dream Takes You, and Grammy Award-winning singer Maya was hired to record the song. Maya was riding on a bit of a high at the time, having just been part of the Lady Marmalade collaboration with Pink, Christina Aguilera, Lil' Kim, and Missy Elliott. The idea being that Where the Dream Takes You would bolster Maya's career the same way Christina Aguilera's had been when she recorded the song Reflection for Mulan in 1998. And if you're wondering why you've never heard of Where the Dream Takes You, it's because it flopped pretty hard, both commercially and critically. Trousdale and Wise approached composer James Newton Howard, who'd recently finished Dinosaur's score for the movie's instrumental score. Since there would be no dialogue in a number of the film's pivotal scenes, Howard collaborated closely with the directors to create a moving soundtrack that reflected the emotional meaning of each scene. In order to create distinct musical themes for the surface world and Atlantis, Newton Howard used an Indonesian orchestral style for the Atlantean theme. Now, I've mentioned this was obviously a completely new avenue for Disney to go down. This was a completely new type of movie. There would be no songs. It would have a more grown-up feel than other Disney animated movies. And in the fledgling internet era, Disney did try to utilize internet marketing for Atlantis, including a website with minigames, through mobile phone networks for mobile games. McDonald's also did the traditional Happy Meal promotions with toys. Elsewhere at Disney, though, plans were afoot. Big plans. They had already envisioned Atlantis as an Adventureland-style movie, taking inspiration from Disney's theme parks. But within the Disney theme park management, there were plans to redo Submarine Voyage at Disneyland California, an attraction which already paid homage to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, an attraction that had opened in 1959, itself inspiration for Atlantis. Submarine Voyage closed in July 1998, and the plans to refresh this attraction with an upcoming feature film made sense. Rebrand it with Disney's next big animated adventure. Disney saw franchise material for Atlantis. An Atlantean encounter, as it was set to be known, was going to be narrated by Preston B. Whitmore, have an encounter with the Leviathan, and other characters would come over the intercom as the ride continued. The plans were to open the attraction in 2003. However, that never happened. What else happened in 2003? Finding Nemo came out and was a huge hit. So this particular attraction is now Finding Nemo Submarine Voyage. That wasn't the only project planned for Disney parks, though. Also planned was Fire Mountain, the latest mountain to add to Space Mountain, Splash Mountain, Big Thunder Mountain Railroad, and Expedition Everest Forbidden Mountain. This attraction for Walt Disney World's Magic Kingdom in Florida planned an epic roller coaster where guests hung like a hang glider, emulating the final part of the movie, taking you through an exploding volcano. Fire Mountain had originally been planned 20,000 leagues under the sea, but was scrapped. And again, having a brand new ride for Disney's brand new big movie made a lot of sense at the time. But just like Atlantis itself, theme park ride plans also just disappeared, becoming myths in their own lore. Atlantis The Lost Empire had its world premiere at Disney's El Capitan Theatre in Hollywood on the 3rd of June 2001. Destination Atlantis was on display at the premiere, featuring behind-the-scenes props from the film and information on the legend of Atlantis, with video games, displays, laser tag, and other attractions. The Aquarium of the Pacific loaned a variety of fish for display within the attraction. A limited release then followed in New York City and Los Angeles on the 8th of June 2001, with a wide release following on the 15th of June 2001. Due to its limited first week opening in 2 cinemas, it opened at 13th at the box office, the same week as Swordfish and Evolution. Swordfish went to number 1 that week. Shrek was second, being out 5 weeks at that point. And yes, there is a reason I'm mentioning Shrek. In Atlantis' second week, it opened wide and jumped up to second place after brand new release Lara Croft Tomb Raider. Shrek was at third. The following week, Atlantis fell to fourth. Shrek was fifth, with only a few $1 million in between the 2 movies. The next week, Atlantis fell to fifth and Shrek to sixth. This time, only $87,000 between the 2 in revenue. The next week, Atlantis fell to ninth. Shrek was eighth, earning $1.5 million more. Shrek had been out 9 weeks at this point, to Atlantis' 5 weeks. The following week, Atlantis was out of the top 10, but Shrek was not. And it's easy to blame Shrek for the failure of Atlantis The Lost Empire. However, they were very different movies. One was very bright, very colourful, very funny, and clearly aimed at a more family market. Atlantis was something completely different. Shrek was the new kid on the block. Everyone was talking about Shrek. And it unfortunately just pushed Atlantis The Lost Empire out of the limelight a little bit. On its $120 million budget, Atlantis The Lost Empire grossed $84.1 million domestically in the US and $102 million internationally, for a total worldwide gross of $186.1 million, which was a huge financial loss for Disney. In recent years, the studio has ironically all but buried Atlantis. It's available on Disney+, but there's no merchandising or characters in promotional material. It also has a disappointing 48% on Rotten Tomatoes, with the consensus reading, Atlantis provides a fast-paced spectacle, but stints on such things as character development and a coherent plot. While some critics like Roger Ebert praised the film as rousing in an old pulp science fiction sort of way, and the New York Times declared it a monumental treat, Variety called the film all talking, no singing, no dancing, and in the end, no fun, and the Washington Post panned it as new-fashioned but old-fangled hash. For the 74th Academy Awards, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences finally recognised animated feature films with a new category, thanks to the growth of animation studios like Pixar and DreamWorks. 10 years after Beauty and the Beast had been nominated for Best Picture at the 64th Academy Awards, Disney were presumably confident that Atlantis would be in with a shot. Not only was rival animation studio DreamWorks' Shrek the inaugural Best Animated Feature winner, Atlantis the Lost Empire was not even nominated for the award, which further exacerbated its box office losses and Disney's overall feelings towards it. Atlantis deserved better, though. In what world is Jimmy Neutron Boy Genius better than this? Just like the proposed attractions for Disneyland and Walt Disney World, the planned animated series, which was going to be Disney Television's answer to the X-Files, was also quietly cancelled. The series, called Team Atlantis, was going to be hugely ambitious, investigating otherworldly phenomena and ancient cultures every week. The first 3 episodes of the TV series were cobbled together and packaged as a direct-to-video sequel called Atlantis: Milo's Return, released almost 2 years after the original film. Now, there are no other sequels and there is no remake of Atlantis: The Lost Empire. However, there is controversy surrounding Atlantis that maybe it was a remake of something else, because there were a number of similarities between Atlantis: The Lost Empire and the anime series Nadia: The Secret of Blue Water, which aired in 1990 to 1991. And this was pointed out by several viewers, especially in story, setting, and character design. Nadia was based on a concept by Hayao Miyazaki and Hideaki Anno, directed by Anno, the director of Shin Godzilla. Both Japanese and American viewers recognized similarities, which was so strong that the film's production company, Gainax, was recommended to sue for plagiarism. Gainax refused to sue, citing Disney's strong legal team and the potential for reprisals. The 1870 Jules Verne novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea served as some inspiration for both Atlantis and Nadia, and Kirk Wise would later say that he'd never heard of the anime until long after Atlantis had completed production. However, there are far more similarities not connected with 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, including the characters, Nadia being the rightful heir to the throne of Atlantis, just like Kida, Jean being a spirited, wide-eyed adventurer, just like Milo, and the magic blue crystal-based technology in both. Both start on land, tradition to an American boat before descending underwater via submarine, featuring a patriarchal captain, a blonde second-in-command, and a cast of international figures, as well as the crew combating a nautical creature. I'm not saying it's exactly like Nadia, but I'm not saying that either, because the evidence would suggest that it is very, very similar, allegedly, because obviously Gainax have never filed any legal suit against Disney for plagiarism, so allegedly Nadia and Atlantis are very similar. Had Atlantis: The Lost Empire been a box office success, it could have easily revolutionized Disney. It would have opened up a whole new world, pun intended, for animation, with Treasure Planet following suit, pushing the limits of theatrical and television animation while taking the studio's cherished animated production in a daring new direction and possibly prolonging the life of 2D hand-drawn animation. Unfortunately, it was a pipe dream, and that was not meant to be. But it's not all doom and gloom for Atlantis: The Lost Empire. It remains one of the most beautiful and epic movies of Disney's animated back catalogue. It's also gained something many Disney movies never do. Atlantis: The Lost Empire has grown into a true cult classic in the years since its release. It has a fervent fan base who adore the movie and its lore. People cosplay as the entire crew of the Ulysses. There are fan petitions to make Kida an official Disney princess, although let's be honest, she's kind of cooler without that label. It has a diverse cast, and it's just unfortunate that we never got to see more from this world. The movie squeezes in the brief experimental period between the Disney Renaissance and what is popularly referred to as the Disney Revival, where the studio was experimenting with genres and styles in the 2D animated world, and while there might have been changes made and corners cut, there is nothing that looks or feels like Atlantis: The Lost Empire in the history of Disney animation. The filmmakers took the lack of oversight from Disney executives and used it to their full advantage. Its striking visual style is genuinely unlike anything Disney had produced to that point, or even to this day. It's little wonder the film has a passionate fan base, and is considered to be an underrated cult classic. Enthusiasm for Atlantis led to a cast and crew live stream reunion in 2021 for its 20th anniversary, and again in 2022. If Disney want to do live action remakes, do it on this. This would be a perfect live action remake. It doesn't have songs or a cuddly animal sidekick. It's a true homage to pulp action adventure films. And with Indiana Jones movies seemingly running out of steam, it seems like the ideal opportunity for Disney to embrace Atlantis. You can fix the plot weaknesses and cliched characters, give Kida more agency, make it a true period piece. And Disney don't even need to bill it as a live action remake, because the fans who know will love it, and those that don't will want to see a fun, well-made action adventure. Timothée Chalamet would make a great Milo Thatch. Tell me it's not just me who sees it. And Michael J. Fox is retired from acting now. But how amazing would it be to see a little Easter egg, a book on Milo's shelf written by Michael J. Fox, something to call back to Fox and how much he brings to the character of Milo, who's written quite flat, but Fox brings him to life with his always energetic performance. Similarly, though, it's not all roses for this movie either. This movie does have glaring issues too, most notably the white saviour narrative, and the fact that a genuinely fascinating story of Indigenous peoples and their culture and background is overshadowed by the story of the explorers and the obvious betrayal of Rourke. Kida should have been the saviour of her own people. The idea that a white American kid knew more about the language than the people did is just baffling logic. The story and characters is where this movie just struggles, as interesting as Kida is, and I genuinely think she's got huge potential to be such a terrific character in Disney history, even without being an official princess. I want to know more about Atlantean culture, the crystals, what it all means. But what does it all mean though? Why does she start floating? I really have no idea, and this movie makes no sense. Even in the background, Disney were quietly retiring hand-drawn animation, making huge layoffs in their animation department and salary cutbacks. But what saves this movie is the stunning animation. Mike Mignola's art style is something so different to what came before. Atlantis, the Lost Empire, like Hercules before it, looks so unique and unusual and underappreciated. It feels like the rare Disney movie not made for merchandising, not made for toys or fast food tie-ins. It was made purely for the love of adventure movies. It didn't cater to children. It was made more for teenagers and adults. Its ardent fans love it because it exposed them to archaeology and linguistics, subjects other animated films just don't even touch on. Atlantis the Lost Empire may have its flaws, but it's also one of Disney's most unique treasures, like a diamond, or indeed a crystal. Thank you for listening. As always, I would love to hear your thoughts on Atlantis the Lost Empire, and thank you for your continued support of this podcast. If you want to get involved and help this podcast, you could tell your friends and family about this podcast. You can leave a rating or review wherever you found this podcast, or you can find me. I'm at Verbal Diorama on all major social media platforms. You can like posts, you can share posts, you can comment on posts, you can do anything you want with posts, or you can just send me a message on one of the social medias. But either way, you can follow Verbal Diorama. It all helps with visibility. Now, as I mentioned, this is the final episode of animation season. However, it is not the final episode of Verbal Diorama. I am not quitting yet. And the next month on Verbal Diorama is going to be celebrating International Women's Day and Women's History Month. And all of the movies that I feature in the month of March are going to be focused on true stories featuring women, or shall we say, inspired by the true stories of women. And I'm going to be starting with the remarkable story of an all-female unit of warriors who protected the African kingdom of Dahomey in the 1800s. It is the story of the Agoji, and it is the movie The Woman King. I am so excited to be talking about The Woman King. I hope you will join me next episode for the history and legacy of The Woman King. Now, I always like to say that this podcast is free, and it always will be free. There will never be any charge to listen to this podcast. However, it is not free to make a podcast, and I rely on some exceptionally generous people to help fund Verbal Diorama and secure the future of Verbal Diorama as well. Now, you're under no obligation to join those people. You can continue to listen for free forever. However, if you enjoy what I do and you get value out of what I do and you want to support an indie creator who does all of this on her own, then you can do that in one of two ways. You can go to verbaldiorama.com/tips and give a one-off tip. Or you can go to verbaldiorama.com/Patreon and you can join the amazing patrons of this podcast. They are Claudia, Simon, Laurel, Derek, Kat, Andy, Mike, Luke, Michael, Scott, Brendan, Lisa, Sam, Jack, Dave, Stuart, Nicholas, Zoe, Kev, Pete, Heather, Danny, Ali, Stu, Brett, Philip M, Michelle, Zenos, Sean, Rhino, Philip K, Adam, Elaine, Kyle, and Aaron. If you want to get in touch, you can email verbaldiorama@gmail.com. You can also fill out the little contact form at verbaldiorama.com as well. You can also find bits that I do at filmstories.co.uk, articles and magazines and such like. But mostly, thank you for being with this podcast for 6 years, and here's to the next 6. And finally,
It's beautiful.
Milo, I gotta hand it to you. You really came through.
Well, I take that back.
Holy cats, who are these guys?
They gotta be Atlanteans.
What? That's impossible.
I seen this back in the Dakota. They can smell fear just by looking at you, so keep quiet.
Neshigitim, Gabrin Defenyo. Lebesa nachtap duerentop. That's all du benertap.
I think it's talking to you.
Lebesa nachtap duerentop. That's all du benertap.
Leb a Senec dop do weren top. Let's all do panic up.
Prawitim dan ganak makin new gebletot bet kaperekek.
Kag wegene preed.
Kagwegene. Wegonos pridos es esenen.
Ida suamice viator.
This is linguam Romae.
Parlez-vous français?
Oui, monsieur.
They speak my language. Pardon, mademoiselle. Voulez-vous...
Ooh, I like her.
About time someone hit him. I'm just sorry it wasn't me.
bye.
Movies you know.